The chandeliers flickered above me as I carried the silver tray across the marble floor. Delicate clinks of glassware and murmurs of perfume-dipped conversation filled the parlor, refined, rehearsed, and devoid of real grief. The Carlyle estate was dressed in mourning, but the people inside had the eyes of treasure hunters, not mourners. Black dresses, tailored suits, pearl earrings that glinted like they had somewhere more important to be. And me? I was just the help, invisible in a black uniform that matched the drapes. They looked right through me as they traded condolences like business cards and scanned the room for the will. But before I tell you what happened next, don't forget to like this video, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this. I was just a shadow, moving quietly through it all. "Would you like some coffee, Mrs. St. James?" I asked gently. Mrs. St. James didn't look up. She simply waved a bejeweled hand and muttered, "No cream." "And don't be late with the petit fours." "I'll let the kitchen know," I said. She still didn't look at me. They never really did. I was 28 years old, and for the past 9, I'd lived here more than I'd lived anywhere else. I knew the sound of the grandfather clock's chime when it ran a minute slow. I knew the way the rose garden smelled after a thunderstorm. I knew which banister creaked at night and which window caught the first light of morning. But none of that showed on my face. I'd learned to carry myself like furniture, seen but not noticed, heard only when useful. "God, this place hasn't changed at all," muttered Cousin Bennett as he stepped into the hallway. "Except maybe for more orchids. Adeline loved her orchids." Aunt Helena sipped from a flute of champagne and replied, "Well, if you were around more, you'd know that's the new Nanny's touch. What was her name again? The quiet one." Bennett rolled his eyes. "Hopefully she doesn't think she's getting a check." They both laughed. The sound was brittle, expensive. I passed them without saying a word. I wasn't the nanny anymore. Not officially. The children were grown, off to boarding school or college, or scattered across time zones, too far to visit and too busy to mourn. But I was still here, still in the background. I had been 19 when I arrived, green, broke, scared. I had answered an ad taped to the side of a college bulletin board. "Live-in nanny. Discretion required. Must love children." I hadn't expected to stay long, but then I met her, Mrs. Adeline Carlyle. She'd opened the door herself that day, in a soft blue blouse and a silver pin shaped like a swan. She'd said, "Elise, isn't it? You look like someone who listens more than she speaks." And I listened, for nearly a decade. Now she was gone, and I was back to being just the help. "Do we know when the reading is?" asked a voice near the piano. It was Oliver, the self-proclaimed next in line who'd once bragged about being Mrs. Carlyle's favorite because he sent her a signed copy of his startup's annual report. "No time confirmed," replied another voice. Becca, his sister, who'd spent most of her 20s trying to turn the family name into a lifestyle brand. "But my lawyer said we should expect something soon." They were already dividing her up like property. "Do you think she left anything to that girl?" asked Becca. "Who, the nanny?" said Oliver. Becca laughed. "Please, Adeline was generous, but she wasn't delusional." I moved past them with a tray of pastries, offering some without speaking. They waved me off without recognition. The florists had done their best. White lilies, baby's breath, silver eucalyptus. The vases were crystal. The arrangement near the fireplace stretched 6 feet wide. "Too sterile," Mrs. Whitaker whispered to her friend. "She should have had roses, red ones, the kind she actually liked." Her friend said, "Oh, Adeline had many sides. This one's just more curated." I wanted to tell them she hated lilies, Always said they smelled like hospitals, but I stayed quiet. That was what I did. The help doesn't correct the guests, not even when the guests are wrong, especially not then. The kitchen buzzed in contrast to the sterile quiet upstairs. I refilled trays, polished cutlery, checked on the servers. I wasn't their boss, but the staff still looked to me for cues. Habit, I guess. "Should we start the next course?" asked one of the caterers, a boy who looked younger than I'd been when I started. I nodded. 10 minutes. He smiled. "You're not just a server, are you?" "I used to live here," I said. "Oh," he said, "are you family?" That word caught in my chest for a second. "No," I said, "just someone who stayed." At one point, I stepped outside to catch my breath. The garden was overgrown at the edges, but still beautiful. Bees moved lazily from bloom to bloom. The wind carried the softest trace of salt from the coast. This garden had been our place. Mrs. Carlyle and I would sit on the bench beneath the willow and drink iced tea. She'd ask about my life, my books, my thoughts on the world. No one else ever had. It was the only place I never felt invisible. Now it felt like a painting I wasn't allowed to touch. Back inside, I walked through the main hall. The guests had gathered for champagne and bites before the memorial. I paused beneath the grand staircase. Above me hung the oil portrait. The Carlyle family. Commissioned 5 years ago. All of them were in it. Becca, Oliver, Aunt Helena, Cousin Bennett, Uncle Marcus, the grandchildren, even the dogs. Not me. Even though I'd helped dress the youngest for that day. Even though I'd been the one to find the pearl earring that rolled under the settee just before the artist began painting. I stood at the base of the stairs now, looking up at it. The eyes in the portrait looked down like monarchs from another century. Not one of them remembered the nights I stayed up with their children through fevers. Not one remembered the quiet birthdays I celebrated alone in the kitchen. Not one of them ever asked how I was doing. They'd only ever asked, "Can you pick her up?" Or, "Can you stay late?" Or, "Can you make yourself scarce for the guests?" I had. Every time. Because I wasn't family. I wasn't in the portrait. I was never meant to be. But she saw me anyway. The first time I stepped through the gates of the Carlyle estate, I felt like an intruder. I was 19. My backpack had a broken zipper, my shoes were worn down at the soles, and my blouse had a wrinkle I couldn't iron out because my roommate had spilled coffee on the iron and then disappeared for 2 days. The ad said, "Live-in nanny, must love children, discretion required." It didn't say anything about needing to feel worthy. I walked up the gravel path, heart pounding, wondering if I should turn around and pretend I'd never come. But then the front door opened, and there she was, Mrs. Adeline Carlyle. She was tall, with white blonde hair pulled into a low twist. Her silk blouse was tucked into cream slacks, not a wrinkle in sight. She had this elegance that didn't come from money. It came from the way she stood still, like she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She looked at me with eyes that didn't scan, didn't measure, just saw. Mrs. Carlyle said, "Elise, isn't it?" I nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She studied me for half a second longer, then said, "You look like someone who listens more than she speaks. I find that promising." I blinked. "I try to," I said. "Good," said Mrs. Carlyle. "Let's get you inside." The house was overwhelming at first. High ceilings, columns that felt like they belonged to a museum. A grand staircase that made me feel small. The staff gave me polite nods, but their eyes said temporary. I was just another college girl who'd burn out and vanish before the spring gala. The family wasn't cruel, not openly, but they were distant, distracted. They spoke to me the way you might talk to an automated voice at a parking garage. except for the kids. On my second day, little Henry ran to me in the garden, wrapped his arms around my knees, and asked, "Are you the one who's staying?" I crouched down. "I think so," I said. "Good," said Henry. The last one never smiled. From that day on, I poured everything into being the smile. I made lunches with handwritten notes tucked inside. I learned the precise order of bedtime songs. The wheels on the bus came last because it helped them settle. I went to every piano recital, soccer game, science fair, even when the parents didn't. I made birthday cakes from scratch. I built blanket forts when they were sick. I brushed tangled hair with slow hands so it wouldn't hurt. And somewhere along the way, they stopped calling me the Nanny and started calling me Elise, like it meant something. Mrs. Carlyle noticed. It wasn't long before she started inviting me for tea. Not every day, just once a week, usually on Tuesdays, around 4. She'd call me into the garden room and pour lapsang souchong into her bone china, then pour mine into a mismatched mug I'd picked out from the kitchen cabinets. "You prefer something with character," she once said. Am I right? I nodded. "I don't like things that look too delicate to touch." She smiled. "Me neither." Me, those teas became my favorite part of the week. She'd ask me questions, not about chores, not about whether the children had eaten, but about me, what books I was reading, what I thought about politics, what I dreamed about when I was little. Sometimes she'd talk too, not about jewels or stocks or social calendars, but about her father, how he used to whistle when he carved wood. About the time she went dancing in Vienna and lost her shoes in the snow. About how none of her children ever listened to music unless someone else was watching. She had a memory like a painter. Everything was color, movement, emotion. And then, one day, she said something I'll never forget. I had just told her about how I was saving up to take one college class at a time, slowly, quietly, with no real plan, just so I wouldn't lose myself entirely. Mrs. Carlyle sipped her tea, looked me in the eyes, and said, "Money doesn't make someone family." "Time does." I stared at her. Mrs. Carlyle continued, "You've spent more hours in this house than any of them. You've seen the tantrums and the grace. You've picked up broken glass after parties and read bedtime stories during thunderstorms. That's presence. That's devotion." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just let it settle into me. Over the years, that feeling deepened. She began trusting me with more than childcare. She asked me to sit in on planning meetings for the children's schooling. She let me weigh in on household decisions, furnishings, renovations, even the color of the new garden trellis. She asked me to help with her correspondence, handwritten notes to old friends, letters to former staff, even birthday messages to distant cousins she never wanted to forget. One day she handed me a ring of keys. "Emergency access," said Mrs. Carlyle. I said, "To what?" She replied, "To everything that matters." The rest of the family never noticed. Or maybe they did and pretended not to. There were whispers now and then. "She's getting too comfortable. She spends more time at the table than in the nursery." Adeline always had a soft spot for strays. But she ignored them. And so did I. Because by then, I wasn't doing it for anyone's approval. I was here because the children needed someone steady. Because the house breathed a little easier when someone lit the fires early and turned off the lights late. Because Mrs. Carlyle gave me space to matter. Sometimes she'd call me up in the evening just to sit with her. No chores, no tasks, just presence. We'd sit on the upstairs balcony with wool blankets over our laps, sipping something warm, staring into the garden lit faintly by moonlight. She'd talk about the legacy she wanted to leave. Not the money, not the art, not the land, the values. People forget that legacy isn't a ledger, Mrs. Carlyle once said. It's a pattern of choices, a rhythm, a tone, what you normalize in silence. She looked at me then, her eyes soft. Mrs. Carlyle said, "You carry that rhythm better than any of them." I didn't cry, but something inside me unclenched. Something that had been braced since I was a teenager. She saw me, really saw me. The contrast was stark. When I walked through the front hall, most of the family still barely noticed. They'd hand me keys to valet the car, though I never did. They'd ask me to fetch coats or refill their drinks even when I wasn't on duty. They didn't bother to learn my last name. They called me the Nanny, even when the kids were away at school. But she never called me that. Mrs. Carlyle always said, Elise. Like it was enough, like I was enough. She didn't need a reason to include me in conversations. She didn't explain my presence to guests. She never told me to wait in the kitchen. She just made room. And when she smiled, I knew this wasn't charity, it was respect. Some nights I'd return to my little room tucked above the east stairwell. Small, warm, quiet, and I'd sit on the edge of the bed and think, I'm not part of this family. But then I'd remember her words. Money doesn't make someone family, time does. And I'd feel okay, because she was the only one who never looked through me. It didn't happen all at once. The shift was gradual, so slow in fact that I didn't even notice it until the invitations stopped coming. At first, I was included in everything. Not as a guest, but as part of the atmosphere, present at birthdays, holidays, charity galas, and Sunday brunches. Always helping, always ready, always in the background but not invisible. But then came the glances, the drawn-out silences, the questions that didn't really ask anything, they only hinted. Did she really need you at the table? Aunt Helena once asked me, smiling just enough to disguise the sting. That smile became familiar. It always meant I'd crossed a line I didn't know existed. The kids still treated me like family when they were around. They hugged me, texted me updates from school, even called during stressful exams. But the adults? They were beginning to see me as something else. Something threatening. The turning point came one summer during a garden brunch. The tables were set on the lawn, white umbrellas shading perfectly arranged fruit towers and tea trays. The Carlyle cousins had all flown in, some from Boston, others from London or New York, and it was the first time in a long while that everyone was in the same place. Mrs. Carlyle had insisted I join her at the table. You've done enough running around today, Mrs. Carlyle said. Sit. I hesitated. Are you sure? Mrs. Carlyle replied, I know what I'm sure of. Sit down, Elise. So I did, and that's when it started. Tricia, a second cousin with sharp eyeliner and sharper opinions, was seated across from me. She looked at me, tilted her head, and said loudly, I'm sorry. Since when does the help join us at the table? Everyone went quiet. Even the birds seemed to pause. Mrs. Carlyle looked directly at her and said, Since the help was the only one who helped raise your nieces? Tricia blinked, thrown by the force of that simple truth. I sat frozen, mortified. After that, things changed. They didn't dare confront Mrs. Carlyle directly, but their whispers grew louder when she wasn't in the room. She's always hovering. She's just trying to secure her future. Adeline's getting sentimental. Once I overheard Oliver say, This is what happens when someone lives off your grandmother for too long. They start thinking they're entitled to the good china. I started being left off emails, then out of photos. I'd show up to help with a family dinner, only to find my name missing from the seating plan. When I asked about it, I'd get distracted shrugs. "Oh, did no one tell you?" said Helena once. "We assumed you'd be too busy anyway." There were moments I nearly quit. Not just once, dozens of times. When I was spoken to like a servant in front of strangers. When someone made a snide comment about knowing my place. When Trisha walked into the room I'd just finished cleaning and said, "Elise, the children don't need you anymore. You can go find a real job." I wanted to leave, to pack up my things and walk out with whatever dignity I had left. But I didn't. Because Mrs. Carlyle would always find me sitting alone after one of those moments. She'd bring tea, always chamomile, always warm, and place it in my hands without asking. Mrs. Carlyle would say, "Stay. There are things I need you to witness." And somehow that mattered more. She started opening up even more. About her childhood, her marriage, the mistakes she'd made, the regrets she kept locked away. "It's strange," said Mrs. Carlyle once as we watched rain spill across the garden path. "You spend your whole life thinking legacy is a name in marble, but in the end, it's the people who remember your mornings, your laugh, the way you fold napkins." I asked, "Do you regret anything?" Mrs. Carlyle replied, "Yes. I regret raising people who don't recognize character unless it comes with a price tag." Her voice didn't shake, her face didn't flinch, but I could see something in her settle, that kind of sadness that has made its peace with the world. The distance between her and the rest of the family widened. They visited less, called less. They sent obligatory birthday gifts, wire transfers, impersonal floral arrangements, but they never came to sit, to listen, to stay. I did. Not because I was trying to earn anything, but because I didn't know how to be anywhere else. Then came the day I knew something had changed. It was a Wednesday morning, and I found her still in bed well past 9. That was unlike her. Mrs. Carlyle woke early, even when she didn't need to. She liked the quiet mornings, the warmth of the sun coming through the east windows. But that day, she didn't stir. Her skin looked dull, her hands colder. I called her name. Gently at first, then again. She opened her eyes slowly. "Elise," said Mrs. Carlyle, "would you call the doctor?" "Of course," I said, trying to sound calm. I need to know," Mrs. Carlyle whispered. "I think I already do." The doctors came, ran tests, whispered in the hallway when they thought I wasn't close enough to hear. She had a heart condition that had worsened. Age and stress, they said. Not emergent, but not nothing either. They offered options, medications, care plans. Mrs. Carlyle waved it all away. That afternoon, I sat by her bed, a teacup balanced on her nightstand, steam curling lazily toward the ceiling. "I'm not afraid," said Mrs. Carlyle. I didn't say anything. "I just need time," she said, and then she reached out and held my hand. "Elise," said Mrs. Carlyle, "don't let them rewrite the story. You know what happened in this house. You saw it." I nodded. "I did." "You remember who showed up? Who stayed?" "I do," I said. She closed her eyes for a long moment, then said softly, "You're the only one I trust to remember." She didn't tell anyone else. Not yet. Not the family. Not the lawyers. Not the children. Just me. And that's when I realized I wasn't staying for the job anymore. I was staying because she'd given me something no one else ever had. Place. The last 2 years were the quietest the Carlyle house had ever been. No parties, no cocktail hours, no tennis matches echoing across the south lawn, just soft music, a few muted television programs, and the steady rhythm of care. Most of the family had stopped visiting. They said they were busy. Business trips, academic sabbaticals, board meetings. There was always something more pressing than sitting with an aging matriarch who no longer held a glass of champagne or graced magazine covers. They still sent cards sometimes. The kind printed from online stores with vague messages like, "Thinking of you," not signed, not handwritten. Only one person ever called consistently. It was me. Mrs. Carlyle spent most mornings by the window in the garden room. I'd make her oatmeal with apples and cinnamon, just the way she liked. She never finished more than half a bowl, but she appreciated the ritual. "Elise," said Mrs. Carlyle one morning, spoon resting in her hand, "do you ever miss your old life?" I looked up from the chair beside her. "This is my life." Mrs. Carlyle smiled faintly. "That's a good answer." I read to her every afternoon. We went through all her favorite books, Woolf, Eliot, Auden. She liked rhythm, even when her memory began to slip. Some days she'd close her eyes halfway through and murmur the endings with me from memory. She'd talk too. Not like before. No long stories, no tangents about Vienna or dancing barefoot at Oxford. Just pieces now, sentences clipped by age. But I listened to every word like it mattered. Because it did. She once said, "Everyone talks so much, but no one really listens to the slow parts." I made sure to listen, even to the silences. There was a nurse who came during the evenings, Michelle. She was kind, professional, never asked too many questions. Sometimes we sat in the kitchen together after Mrs. Carlyle had gone to bed. Michelle asked me once, "Are you related?" I shook my head. "No." Michelle looked surprised. "You're here every day." I shrugged. "I stay." She smiled. "We don't get many people who do." Spring bled into summer, summer thinned into fall, and still no one came. The guest rooms remained untouched, the linens stayed pressed, the wine cellar collected more dust than corks pulled. Once, I asked Mrs. Carlyle if she wanted me to call anyone. She said, "They'll come when it matters to them." She didn't say that with bitterness. She said it like a fact. On the last night, the sky outside turned a dusky lavender, and the wind carried a chill into the hallway. I tucked a blanket around her shoulders and read from her favorite poem. When I closed the book, I saw she was watching me. Her eyes were clearer than they had been in weeks. "Elise," said Mrs. Carlyle, "whatever they say about you tomorrow, remember this. I chose you." I swallowed. "I know." "No," said Mrs. Carlyle, voice firm now. "Remember, when they lie to themselves, when they pretend they were here, when they rewrite the endings." She reached for my hand. "You stayed." I said, "I stayed." She smiled again, her grip light as paper. "Good girl." She passed a few hours later, just before dawn. I was still in the chair beside her. I hadn't planned to fall asleep, but when I woke, I knew. There was a stillness in the room that didn't belong to sleep. I took her hand again, even though it had already grown cold. I whispered, "Thank you." Then I stood and drew the curtains back so the morning light could fall across her face. The calls went out. The family responded quickly, quicker than I expected. Within hours there were texts from unfamiliar numbers. Flights were being booked, schedules cleared. There were questions about arrangements, florists, who would deliver the eulogy. Someone even asked about catering. I was still in the same clothes from the night before. I didn't reply. They arrived the next day. Black cars, glossy shoes, perfume too sharp for a house still grieving. They filled the rooms with voices and opinions, arguing over flower colors and seating charts.
Trisha pulled me aside briefly in the hallway. "I assume you'll help coordinate," said Trisha. You knew her routines. "I'll do what's necessary," I said. Trisha glanced at my cardigan, the same one I wore most days. "Maybe dress up a little for the memorial," Trisha said, just so people don't get confused. Confused about what? I asked. Trisha waved a hand. You know, roles. The morning of the memorial, the house transformed. White roses draped the staircase. Framed photos appeared on every surface. Mrs. Carlyle on yachts, at charity galas, cutting ribbons. Not a single photo showed her with a blanket over her knees and a book in her lap. The version of her they wanted to remember was polished, powerful, sharp. Not the woman who had laughed softly at my clumsy pancakes, or told me bedtime stories from her own childhood, or cried when the nurse told her she could no longer walk unassisted. They mourned a myth. I grieved a person. I didn't sit with them during the service. I stood in the back, tucked beneath the old oak beam near the library door. The same spot I'd stood for years, quiet, unnoticed, present. Aunt Helena gave a speech. It was elegant, scripted. She was the backbone of this family, said Aunt Helena. I thought of the holidays she skipped. She never missed a moment, said Oliver. I thought of the birthdays with video calls instead of visits. Trisha cried real tears, or maybe just good ones. They mourned her as if they had been part of her final years, as if they had watched her eyes fade and her hands weaken, as if they had stayed. They hadn't. They showed up now, for the show, for the performance, for the reading of the will, but not for her. Not when it counted. Not when the house creaked with quiet and tea cooled on the side table untouched. Not when she whispered her final wishes to a girl who was never supposed to matter. I stayed in the shadows that day. I served drinks, answered small logistical questions, smiled politely when I was told, "She always spoke so highly of you." I knew better. She didn't just speak. She chose. And that's what mattered. The mahogany doors to the study creaked open at exactly 3 o'clock. The family filed in slowly, dressed in shades of charcoal, midnight, and jet black silk. A few clutched leather portfolios. Most held nothing but expectation. I sat near the back. Not because I was told to, but because that's where I always sat. I hadn't yet learned how to take up space in rooms I used to serve tea in. The air was thick with cologne, perfume, and the unspoken tension of impending wealth. They didn't cry at the memorial, but now they sat very still. Money always makes people quiet. The Carlyle estate attorney, Mr. Hammond, cleared his throat. He wore a navy suit that looked older than most of the cousins in the room, and he shuffled papers with the patience of a man who had seen this kind of gathering far too many times. Mr. Hammond said, "As you all know, I was Mrs. Carlyle's legal counsel for over 2 decades. What we are about to read is her final will and testament, witnessed and notarized under appropriate conditions, and revised 2 years prior to her passing." Aunt Helena raised her hand slightly, as if this were a courtroom. Aunt Helena said, "2 years ago? That's rather recent." Mr. Hammond replied, "She was of sound mind. The changes were reviewed and confirmed." Trisha leaned toward her brother and whispered, "This is probably about the garden. Maybe the foundation." Oliver whispered back, "She probably left it to charity, unless that girl got in her head." He didn't whisper as softly as he thought. Mr. Hammond began to read, too. The standard things came first: her requests for the burial site, charitable donations to specific nonprofits, a small endowment to a historic preservation society. No one blinked. Then came the names. "To my grandson, Oliver Carlyle, I leave my collection of antique maps." Oliver's shoulders relaxed. A faint smile played at the corners of his mouth. "To my niece, Trisha Carlyle, I leave my grandmother's sapphire brooch and my personal collection of first edition cookbooks." Trisha gave a little exhale, like she'd dodged a bullet. "To various other family members, I leave mementos and symbolic tokens outlined in this document." Then there was a pause. Mr. Hammond looked up over his glasses. Mr. Hammond said, "The remainder of the estate, including all financial assets, property holdings, business shares, and the Carlyle residence, shall be inherited in full by Elise Hart." The silence was immediate. Then the room erupted. Aunt Helena was the first to speak. Aunt Helena said, "What on earth is this?" Trisha's voice cracked as she said, "She's not even family." Oliver stood, his face red, and pointed in my direction. Oliver shouted, "This is ridiculous. She must have manipulated her." Mr. Hammond raised a hand calmly. Mr. Hammond said, "There is also a personal letter from Mrs. Carlyle to accompany the will. Would you like me to read it?" Trisha hissed, "She can't do this." Mr. Hammond said, "She did." He unfolded the handwritten letter with practiced hands. His voice softened. Mr. Hammond read aloud. "To those gathered, I imagine many of you are surprised. Some may be disappointed, but I want this to be perfectly clear. Elise is not a blood relative, but she is the only one who stayed. In my final years, while others sent texts or silence, she brought me tea. While some complained about flights, she read to me. While you mourned my image, she mourned my breathing. Family is not just blood. It's who shows up. It's who listens in the quiet moments. It's who keeps the lights on when no one else remembers you live in the dark. Elise never asked for anything. She gave me time, so I am giving her something in return: peace and place. With love, Adeline Carlyle." The room was quiet now. No one made eye contact. I kept my gaze on the grain of the wood table. I didn't smile. I didn't smirk. I didn't flinch. I just breathed. Because even though I had read that letter in her handwriting with my own eyes, hearing it aloud was something else. It made it real. Cousin Bennett stood and said, "This has to be contested." Aunt Helena muttered, "It's emotional sabotage." Trisha whispered something about calling a lawyer. Greg, the only one who hadn't said a word, rubbed his temples and stared down at the floor like it had betrayed him too. Mr. Hammond closed the folder and placed it gently on the table. Mr. Hammond said, "Mrs. Carlyle's wishes are legally binding and fully enforceable. The estate transfers effective immediately." Oliver leaned on the edge of the table. Oliver said, "She never told us." Not once. I spoke for the first time. I said, "You never asked." That silenced him. No one looked at me. Not directly. They stood one by one and left the room, some quietly, some in angry pairs. No one offered congratulations. No one hugged me, and I didn't need them to, because the only person whose approval had ever mattered was already gone. And she'd left her answer in ink. I remained seated for a long while after the room emptied. Mr. Hammond walked over and handed me the letter, now folded neatly. Mr. Hammond said, "She trusted you." Completely. I nodded. She taught me what trust looks like. Mr. Hammond said, "I've read a lot of wills." That one was different. I smiled, small but certain. I said, "So was she." As I stood and walked out of the room, the house felt different. Not louder. Not fuller. Just mine. Not because of the deed, or the fortune, or the shock etched into every relative's face, but because I knew every creak in the floor, every breeze that drifted through the east windows, every book spine, every kettle, every dusty corner no one else bothered to learn. I had earned this life the slow way, one day at a time, one bedtime story at a time, one conversation, one cup of tea, one choice to stay, when everyone else had left. They didn't know whose name was on the papers, but she did. She always did. The morning after the will reading, the sun rose exactly the same way it had for the last 10 years, bright over the rose trellises, soft on the east lawn. But the silence felt different. I stood at the edge of the garden in my usual cardigan, looking up at the windows of the estate I'd lived in for nearly a decade. The house was mine now. Every hallway, every key, every dusty ledger in the study. But I didn't feel like moving in, because this place had never been about possession. It had been about presence. I didn't rush to change anything. No dramatic redecorating, no eviction letters, no velvet ropes or marble plaques. Instead, I walked room by room, remembering. The spot where I taught Ava to tie her shoes. The hallway where Miles had his first panic attack before a recital. The kitchen counter where Mrs. Carlyle once cried over a burned scone and laughed about how even old money can't bake. I left those memories untouched. But I changed something deeper. I set up a meeting with Mrs. Carlyle's accountant, a woman named Frances, who had always treated me with quiet respect. Frances said, "So, what do you want to do?" I looked at the folder in front of me, portfolios, property values, offshore holdings, and said, "I want to give it away." Frances blinked. "I'm sorry?" I said, "Not all of it, but enough to start something." Frances asked, "What kind of something?" I said, "Something Mrs. Carlyle would have been proud of." I founded the Adeline Foundation that summer. We started small, scholarships for young women going into teaching and nursing, grants for single mothers, free childcare vouchers for workers in the surrounding towns. The east wing of the estate was converted into a community space. The grand ballroom, where Tricia once threw a birthday gala that cost more than most people's yearly rent, became a venue for local workshops, book drives, and music nights. People came, not to take pictures, not to whisper about inheritance, but to belong. The emails started 2 weeks later. The first was from Oliver. Oliver wrote, "I understand emotions are high, but I do believe a fair distribution of the estate would honor everyone's legacy." Then Aunt Helena, "Surely Mrs. Carlyle didn't intend to cut her own blood out. Perhaps we can arrange a more private solution?" Tricia's came last. A single line. "You've made your point. Don't get carried away." I didn't respond, because there was nothing left to explain. One morning, I found a letter in the mailbox, not printed, not emailed. A real envelope, hand-addressed. Inside was a card in careful script. "Elise, I heard what happened. I just wanted to say, you're the only one who earned it. Thank you for being there when none of us were. Ava." I hadn't seen her since she left for college. She'd been quiet during the memorial, hugging me tightly but saying little. This was her voice now, clearer than ever. I pressed the card to my chest. For a long moment I just stood there and let it sink in. The family didn't come back, not to visit, not to see what I had built. But the town did. Retired teachers, young mothers, volunteers, donors. They came in waves, grateful and curious. Some asked how I ended up in charge of a mansion. I told them the truth. "I stayed," I said. "That's all. Sometimes I still heard the voices in my head. She's just the help. She probably got in her head. She's not even family." But I answered them with something stronger now. I answered them with classrooms filled with opportunity, with after-school programs, with pantry deliveries, with handwritten notes from children I'd never met. I didn't need to fight those voices anymore. I'd outgrown them. One afternoon, I was sitting in the garden with a woman named Teresa, a local teacher who'd just received one of the foundation's grants. Teresa looked around and said, "This place must feel like a kingdom." I smiled. I said, "No. It feels like a promise kept." Mrs. Carlyle once told me that legacy wasn't about wealth. It was about what survives you. She had chosen her successor not through bloodlines, but through shared values, quiet service, steady loyalty, earned trust. She didn't give me the money so I could climb above the people who looked down on me. She gave it to me because she knew I'd never stop looking out for others. People still whisper. They still say things like, "Well, she got lucky," or "She was in the right place at the right time." But I know the truth. I wasn't lucky. I was present. I didn't take her money. I took her mission. And I carried it forward, one life at a time. I still keep the letter she wrote for the will, folded carefully in my desk drawer. Sometimes I read it when the house is quiet and the garden is still. Family is not just blood, it's who shows up. They thought I was just the nanny, but I was never just anything. The roses had bloomed again. Thick, velvety crimson petals curled against morning dew, climbing across the lattice in the south garden, just as they always had. Mrs. Carlyle used to call them her girls, fussing over each bud as if it were a debutante preparing for a grand ball. I walked the path slowly, letting the silence settle around me like a second skin. The estate felt different now, not heavier, not haunted, just softer, free. The iron benches we'd once polished for events now hosted quiet conversations and the occasional book left behind by a volunteer. The great oak at the rear of the garden, once trimmed obsessively, now grew wild and regal, branches stretching with untamed grace. A young boy rode past on a scooter, his helmet a size too big. His mother jogged behind him, laughing breathlessly. They weren't guests, they were part of it now. Inside the house, the floorboards still creaked at the same intervals. The sun still spilled through the east windows in long amber slants. But there were new sounds too. Children giggling, chairs shifting during community meetings, coffee brewing in the old butler's pantry. The mansion had stopped performing and started living, just as she wanted. I stood by the window in the music room, the one Mrs. Carlyle used to sit at on gray afternoons, and held her letter again. The envelope was soft now, edges curled, folds worn smooth from being read too many times. I unfolded the page carefully. "This is your home now. Make it kind." That was all she had written on the second note, the one tucked behind the legal documents. No signatures, no ceremony, just 7 words. I whispered them aloud. I said, "This is your home now. Make it kind." And then I folded the paper again and pressed it to my heart. In the front foyer, a woman in her early 20s looked up from her clipboard as I entered. She had freckles across her nose and nervous energy in her hands. Her blouse was neatly tucked in, though her name tag was askew. She smiled shyly. The new nanny. Her name was Jamie. Jamie said, "Excuse me, sorry, are you Ms. Hart?" I nodded. "Yes." Jamie said, "I'm here for the orientation. They told me to meet with the director?" I smiled. I said, "That's me." Her eyes widened. "Oh, I thought maybe you were—" She trailed off. I laughed gently. I said, "It's okay. I get that a lot." Jamie said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to assume." I waved her apology off. "You're fine. Come with me." I walked her through the new childcare wing, pointing out the renovated nursery, the Montessori-style play areas, the quiet room for naps and reading. She asked questions, took notes. She reminded me of myself, wide-eyed and a little overwhelmed, trying hard not to let it show. Jamie said, "This place is incredible. I mean, I've never seen anything like it." I said, "It didn't always look like this." Jamie said, "So how did you end up here?" I paused. It was such a simple question, but it held so many versions of the answer. Finally, I smiled and said, "I stayed. That's all." Later that afternoon, I stepped back into the garden, letting the sunlight kiss my shoulders. Volunteers were packing up from a small story circle near the fountain. A young girl waved at me. I waved back. I found my seat beneath the rose trellis, Mrs. Carlyle's favorite bench. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap. And I let myself remember. I remembered the smell of cinnamon tea, the sound of pages turning, the way Mrs. Carlyle's voice softened when she said my name. I remembered her eyes, sharp even in her last days. The way she never said, "You're just the nanny." She'd always said, "You're the one I trust." I remembered the nights I almost gave up, the days I felt invisible, the mornings I woke early, not for pay, but for purpose. And I remembered the moment I realized she had seen something in me that I hadn't yet found in myself. Now, People came to me for advice, for guidance, for answers. But it wasn't because I had money. It was because I'd built something worth sharing, and I shared it, not because I needed to prove anything, but because she had given me the permission to. I still kept the piano dusted, though no one really played it now. I still kept her favorite teacup in the cabinet, untouched, not as a shrine, but as a reminder. That kindness lives longer than wealth. That presence matters more than blood. That love, when chosen, is stronger than legacy. One of the foundation board members passed me on the path and nodded. She said, "Elise, we got a thank you letter from a mother in the East District. Her son's back in school because of the childcare stipend."
I smiled. I said, "That's exactly why we do it." In the evening, after the staff left and the house fell quiet again, I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea. I walked up the stairs I once climbed holding bedtime bottles, past the guest rooms, to the library. I lit the small lamp beside the reading chair, and I sat down to write. Not a report, not a ledger, just a note. "Dear Mrs. Carlyle, I made it kind. Thank you for seeing me. Elise." She saw who I really was, long before I ever did. And because of that, I became her legacy. So before you go, don't forget to click that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Have a blessed day. Your subscription means more than you know.